11-year-old Mikelle Biggs was outside her Mesa home riding her bike when she was taken on January 2nd, 1999. It's been 25 years and the case remains unsolved. But I was able to speak one-on-one with Mesa Police Detective Paul Sipe, who recently took over the case. I've learned the investigation is circling back to a sexual predator who has been on their radar since the beginning. Here's a breakdown of the case.
Shortly before 6 o'clock, Mikelle and her sister Kimber were outside playing. They'd heard music from what they thought was an ice cream truck. Initially that was a lead, however, that turned out to not be fruitful. They'd gone inside to get money from their mother to buy an ice cream. She gave them 2 quarters and they went outside. Mikelle was riding her bike, and they were waiting for the ice cream truck. Kimber decided she was cold. She ran back into the house to grab her jacket. Her mother told her to bring Mikelle in also. So she went back outside. She was only inside for maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes. And when she came back outside, Mikelle's bike was in the street along with the quarters for the ice cream truck.
3 months ago, how did things start? Was it that the past detective retired and so you kind of moved in?
I did work with the detective prior to. She did retire. However, we do have about 104 cold cases. So this was just one of many.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
I've been a Mesa police officer for 29 years. I started in 1994. I worked patrol for 7 or 8 years. Then I was on a community action team. I went to organized crime for about 7 years, and then for about the last 10 years I've been in homicide.
Do you remember this case? I know you weren't necessarily in the homicide unit yet, but do you remember hearing about the case or, kind of watching everything unfold?
Yes, I do.
Now being able to work on the case, one that you saw, I'm sure it kind of adds another, element to that. What do you remember from back then?
Well, it is unique because it is a kidnapping of a child. We hear about those a lot, but it's really one of the lowest frequency things to occur. Everybody in the police department at that time, including me, had some hand in working on the case, even if it was just assisting detectives. Anybody that came to work at the police department after that point, we had thousands of tips coming in, and you seldom can find an officer that worked within that 10-year period after that where someone didn't provide them with a tip or information that they'd heard. Wow. So it pretty much touched everybody that worked here at the police department at the time.
Around that time, were you assigned to do anything specific?
I went with some detectives in the following day to contact, possible investigative leads.
What are you hoping to do now that you've been able to take over? I know there's lots of steps you have to go through and there's several different cases. So for this case specifically, what is your plan?
Well, looking at this case, we have received thousands and thousands of tips. However, we do have some very specific tips for a very good investigative lead. So my goal is to kind of follow up on that, maybe speak with that person, maybe employ that person to, at the very least, tell us where the body is, even if it's anonymously.
In cases where, such as this, there is no body yet, how hard is that, or how hard does that make it for investigators?
Obviously, if you have a body, it's considerably easier. I think homicide by its nature is maybe not super easy because at least the victim is not here to tell their story. So in this case, where from information that we received about this investigative lead, we can have a decent idea of what we think happened, but getting to that point where we can put that all together without a body is difficult.
Was there any DNA that was left at the scene? I know that there was, the bike. I'm sure the girl's, handprint and maybe the sister's is on that. But I didn't know if there were any marks, like maybe hit by a car or handprints of somebody else that you guys can now go back and maybe try another DNA lab or anything.
I can tell you there's no marks consistent with being hit by the car. So that isn't necessarily an issue. That's clearly not what happened. As far as the evidence we have, I'm reluctant to discuss what we do or don't have at this point.
Of course. Talk about why that is, for people who, might say, well, we want more answers.
Anytime something like this happens, especially in this particular incident, you probably have one person for sure that knows what happened because that person is the suspect. You may have a witness, but other than that, you don't have anything that's going to tie that person to the scene. So that's where we look to some of these physical evidence things such as fingerprints and DNA. So we're reluctant to discuss what we may or may not have with that.
For you at this point, are you guys kind of at a standstill, or do you feel like there's going to be some movement in this case?
It's hard to tell. I do think that we have some movement that we're going to be pursuing, especially with this investigative lead. And if we can get some information from that way, or we can look at the evidence that we do have and staff it with the county attorney, then we may get some movement.
Now, was this something that the past detective was already working on and then you kind of are moving that, forward? Or was it a lead that came in just recently that you now are looking into?
I don't think it's really either. The past detective was working on it, but also working on the 103 other cases. At that time, I think there was 116 or 17. What happened is I have to familiarize myself with the cases. This one obviously is a huge file of paperwork. So in familiarizing myself with it, I was able to find some things that I think are significant leads that we can follow up on.
In the past, I know that there was a person that lived in the area that was a sexual predator and was interviewed at the time, at one point even considered a person of interest. Is that person still a person of interest?
I would say he is the person of interest.
Detective Paul Sipe confirms Dee Blaylock is that person. He's never been charged with any crimes in the Mikelle case, but lived in her neighborhood at the time.
If you're my neighbor and I see that you're living next to me and I see something suspicious going on, I guarantee you I'll be calling 911.
ABC15 found this video after spending hours researching our archives, showing Blaylock at a block watch event for Mikelle just 10 days after her disappearance. Detective Sipe has requested a copy of that footage. He says his goal is to speak with Blaylock, who was taken into custody for unrelated violent crimes just months after speaking at that Mikelle event. Blaylock remains behind bars. What do you want to say to the community or the family that was impacted?
That we're still working this, that we want to find Mikelle and get her home, even if the resolution is that she's not alive. More importantly, what I'd like to say to the investigative lead that we have is that he has children of his own, and knowing that and imagining what he would feel like if his children were missing for 25 years and he doesn't know where they are, please reach out so that we can reunite Mikelle with her parents.
Looking at this case, I remember, I think it was like maybe 2018, that there was a dollar bill that was brought to the department's attention, found in another state that said, "I'm Mikelle," or something like that.
Yeah, so that was determined to be a hoax. The family had seen it. They don't believe that's her handwriting. Her name was misspelled. Simple things that, obviously Mikelle was old enough to spell her own name. So those things made the family believe, and then the follow-up that the previous detective did made her believe also that that's a hoax.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. When something like that happens, how hard is it? Because I'm sure you guys have to look into it regardless of whether you think it's, valid or not, and that's time and resources spent, and then getting the hopes up of the family.
Yeah, so in this particular case specifically, I know we've had thousands and thousands of tips over the years. In the years and months immediately after, we had thousands of tips, and tremendous amounts of resources were put into following these tips up, and it generated many thousand pages of report, much of which, when you read it now, you realize that they were dead ends or not credible information, but that still takes away. We couldn't even calculate the number of hours it took away from detectives, that could have been spent on more fruitful leads.
At the very beginning, I know her dad was looked at.
It was very difficult, and you understand that in most missing children's cases, it is a family or close family friend, and he was more than willing to. He understood that. He was very forthcoming with information, and he worked with them, and so it was really hard that even after they knew that he couldn't have been, guilty because of his location and the time it would have taken. I mean, they knew that he didn't do it. He was still looked into.
At that time, she felt like maybe detectives spent a lot of time on her dad and not looking elsewhere. Is there anything that you can say kind of regarding that?
It's obvious that Mikelle's father had nothing to do with it, but that's something that we come to with hindsight, with the actual looking into the incident. I know we've had thousands of tips since then, all completely unfounded, that would point fingers at the father with no evidence or no real substance to it. So while you have to look at the father, I know we were looking at other leads, but you can understand where Kimber was coming from. That's what she's seeing in that moment. And I think from a police perspective, I think we probably wish that we could have eliminated him earlier, like quickly, because then we could have concentrated on things that really mattered.
It's very interesting that I go and I give a presentation about family perspective, but I'm also getting perspective as well from observing the presentation, and I think that's like the key thing.
She's now working with a national organization for missing children and share presentations with first responders, looking at what she's doing. Do you find that helpful for law enforcement?
Absolutely. She has a unique experience. This, as we talked about earlier, this is not something that happens very often, in any city in the United States. Does it happen? Yes, but it's not very frequent. So, number one, she's being a great advocate for her sister. And number two, she's trying to bring lessons that she learned, that the police department learned, to other agencies, so that when they experience something like this, they're able to overcome it.
Talk about the community involvement at that time and how that helped. I know a lot of people were passing out flyers and searching and all of that.
Yeah, again, those thousands of tips, a lot of those came from passing out flyers, from people seeing things. It was before 9/11, and we hadn't heard the see something, say something mantra at that time, but still people were calling in tips, things that they'd seen, whether they're helpful or not. It's still good to get the information so that you can vet it out and figure out if it's important, and that was a huge part of the case.
Yeah. Anything that in hindsight you look back and you wish could have been done differently? I know that time has changed, so there's so much, but
you can always look back and say, I wish that they would have done this or that. But I'm also doing that with the perspective of hindsight myself. DNA wasn't huge then. It was starting to be, but it wasn't the huge investigative tool it is now. People didn't carry cell phones. Those are huge investigative tools now that we didn't have then. So it's a little hard to look in the past, and you can wish that we would have done this or that, but given the times and the resources and what was available evidence-wise at that point, I don't know that I would have even known that if I was there.
Do you think this case is solvable?
Yes.